And now, a passage from the United States and Vietnam, 1787 to 1941. From Chapter 1, Merchant Ships and Their Captains. The Fame and Captain Jeremiah Briggs. In 1802, the Crown and Shields of Salem, Massachusetts, one of the principal shipping families of New England, sent a vessel to Cochin China, apparently to test a new and untried source for sugar and coffee. The Crown and Shields seemed confident that if the voyage to Cochin China failed, the ship could pick up a lucrative cargo in Borneo or elsewhere along the route, and the voyage would not be in vain. In any event, this was the first American ship of record to visit Vietnam, and its captain the first American to set foot there. The ship chosen for the voyage, the Fame, which was launched with great fanfare, sailed on 17th January 1803, captained by Jeremiah Briggs. On 15th May 1803, the Fame sighted the island of Polo Condore off the southern coast of Cochin China. The next morning, the ship sighted Cape St. James on the southern coast and continued up the coast. On 21st May, the Fame anchored in Tehran, present-day Da Nang Bay. Briggs boarded one of two ships in the bay and found they belonged to the King of Cochin China and were commanded by Frenchmen. He set off for Da Nang to see the ship's officers returning to the Fame the next day. The French commodore with whom Briggs spoke in Da Nang advised him to go to Cau, presumably Hue, the capital, to see the king in order to learn whether there was any possibility of trade. Briggs set out for Hue on 23rd May in a small boat, with 5 hands and a local Portuguese pilot from Macau. They spent the night at Haifu, a place of some trade. Briggs' journal records that there was not the least appearance of industry there. They are the most indolent set of beings that ever I saw. They live principally on fish, which they have in abundance. Their huts are in general small, and entirely open to the air, which the climate makes necessary, for it is excessive warm. The next day, Briggs set out again for Hue up the Haifu River, which he found navigable by junks and even small ships. When Briggs arrived at Hue, he boarded a frigate anchored there and found a Frenchman in command. Briggs stayed 3 days with the Frenchman and learned that he had never heard of such a thing as getting a cargo of sugar on this part of the coast, and that he did not think it a possibility. However, the Frenchman sought the king's authorization for Briggs to trade at any port on the coast. The king gave his authority, but Briggs noted he was very jealous at first that we came to trade with his enemies, as he'd had possession of this place only about 6 months. After being away from the ship 6 days, Briggs returned to the Fame with the king's authority to trade. For the next 10 days, the Fame spent its time taking soundings along the coast, but apparently without ever putting into land again, because of the strong currents encountered. On 10th June, the Fame headed for Manila. The remainder of the portion of Briggs' journal on Cochin China consists of a description of that country, information he presumably obtained through his contacts with the local French ship commanders, and a brief account of recent political events in Cochin China in which he noted increased French influence there. Briggs also briefly described the city of Hue, its impressive cannon defenses, the council house, the citadel, and the king, his concubines, royal guard, and elephants. Finally, Briggs' log records that the king sent a French priest to see Briggs to get a description of the United States and its boundaries. The brig Franklin and Captain John White. The second recorded account of an American visiting Vietnam is that of John White, a lieutenant in the U.S. Navy, whose ship, the brig Franklin, anchored off Cape St. James, Vung Tau, on 7th June 1819. White, born in Marblehead, Massachusetts in 1782, was elected a member of the East India Marine Society of Salem, Massachusetts in 1806. He died in Boston in 1840 after achieving the rank of commander. White's account of his voyage was published in 1823 in Boston under the title A History of a Voyage to the China Sea. In it, White states his belief that the Franklin was the first American ship to display the stars and stripes before the city of Saigon. His editor mentions several unsuccessful efforts by American ships seeking cargoes in Vietnam that preceded his, including the voyage of the Fame, captained by Jeremiah Briggs. White himself acknowledges that 2 other Americans actually set foot in Saigon shortly before he did, but that one, Oliver Blanchard, captain of the ship Marmion, out of Boston, was stricken ill in Saigon and died even before his ship left Vietnamese waters. White mentions 2 other American ships that visited Cochin China during the same period, the Beverly, belonging to the owner of the Marmion and captained by John Gardner, and the Aurora of Salem, Massachusetts, captained by Robert Gold. In his memoir, White gives no clue as to why he undertook the voyage to Cochin China. His mission was clearly a commercial one, to find and bring back a profitable cargo. But he does not explain either why a brig under the command of an American naval officer was given such a mission or who financed the mission. Neither does White indicate what interest there was generally in the United States at the time in Cochin China per se, or even how much the young republic knew about that particular part of the world. His memoir does, however, give some evidence of knowledge about the area. In it, he makes several references, either in the text or in footnotes, to available sources of information on Cochin China, including Poivre, whose writings had come to Thomas Jefferson's attention. In fact, White must have read the same passage from Poivre that attracted Thomas Jefferson's curiosity about Cochin Chinese rice. Like Jefferson, White refers to 6 kinds of rice grown in Cochin China, although White claimed that 2 were upland or mountain varieties, while Jefferson spoke of 3 upland varieties. Like Jefferson, White sought to bring home samples of the rice, but unfortunately, the weevils and other vermin destroyed the vegetative principle in all of them. Finally, White refers frequently to objects which he brought back and deposited in the East Asia Marine Society Museum in Salem, Massachusetts. Some of these objects are still in the Peabody Museum in that city. John White's account of his trip to Cochin China is quite simply an account of the trip itself, the people he found, their character, their customs, their habits, their government, and their country. The book's interest to readers today lies chiefly in that it is the first detailed and published account of an American's visit to Vietnam, and that it provides a vivid example of an early American reaction to the Vietnamese and their ways. Lieutenant White sailed from Salem, Massachusetts on Saturday, 2nd January 1819, in the brig Franklin, a ship of 250 tons burthen. After an initial contact with local authorities at Vung Tau, the Franklin moved the next day to the village of Canggio, about 7 miles west of Vung Tau, and awaited permission to proceed up the river to Saigon. Permission never came, and after several days of exasperating discussions with the local authorities, White concluded that the local authorities were not empowered to authorize him to proceed to Saigon. On 12th June, therefore, he weighed anchor for Hue, the capital of Cochin China, and the residence of the king. The local mandarins at Canggio assured White that if he returned from Hue with a proper document from the king, he might proceed to Saigon. The Franklin arrived in Tehran, present-day Da Nang, on 18th June. It was immediately visited by local authorities who informed White that the king was absent from Hue in Tonkin, North Vietnam, that the country was recovering from devastating wars, and that what little produce, sugar, and raw silk there was in the country available for commercial purposes had already been promised to 2 French ships, which had earlier contracted to supply the king with fancy articles and arms and uniforms for his troops. In July, White proceeded to Manila to find someone who spoke Vietnamese and could accompany them back to Cochin China and help them obtain permission to proceed up the river to Saigon, for that was still the place to which our wishes pointed. White stayed in Manila 2 months, during which time, by a stroke of luck, he met Captain John Brown of the Marmion out of Boston, originally under the command of Captain Oliver Blanchard. The Marmion had apparently arrived at Vung Tau and Canggio a few days after the Franklin had departed. Blanchard and his fellow officers were received more hospitably by the local mandarins, apparently profiting from the reaction of the viceroy at Saigon to the news of the Franklin's arrival downriver. In any case, the viceroy had sent an interpreter who was able to communicate indifferently in Eastern Portuguese. Through this interpreter, Blanchard received permission to proceed to Saigon in a local craft with one other officer, a Mr. Putnam, and a sailor who spoke some Portuguese. However, once in Saigon, Blanchard found he could use his doubloons only at a very great discount, and that the Saigon authorities greatly preferred Spanish dollars, with which they were more familiar. Blanchard therefore gave up the thought of taking a cargo in Saigon and decided to proceed to Manila for this purpose. Unfortunately, he took sick in Saigon and died even before the Marmion left the river at Vung Tau. John Brown took command of the ship and continued to the Philippines, arriving there 22nd June. During their stay in the Philippines, another American ship arrived after a brief unsuccessful visit to Cochin China. This was the Beverly, belonging to the owner of the Marmion, which had attempted to sail down the coast from Da Nang to Vung Tau but was driven off by the monsoon. Captains White and Brown decided to join forces and return to Saigon with both ships, calculating that 2 ships might even force their way up to Saigon if the local authorities at Vung Tau and Kanggyo resisted. The crews carried out needed repairs on the Marmion, exchanged gold doubloons for Spanish dollars, waited out the southwest monsoon, then sailed for Cochin China once again on 6 September. The 2 ships anchored off Vung Tau for the second time on 25th September. Proceeding the next day to Kanggyo, they received permission to go on to Saigon within a few days, and on 7th October, after a 7-day journey up the Danai River, a passage of 59.5 miles, according to White, the Franklin followed shortly by the Marmion, anchored in the river opposite Saigon. On 9th October, the 2 captains, together with their second officers, Mr. Bessel of the Franklin and Mr. Putnam of the Marmion, and a sailor from the Marmion who spoke Portuguese, entered the city of Saigon. They soon learned from the interpreter provided by the Cochin Chinese that 2 other American ships had visited Cochin China since the Franklin first dropped anchor at Kanggyo. One of these had been the Aurora of Salem, commanded by Captain Robert Gold. Like the Franklin, the Aurora stayed off Vung Tau for several days after the Marmion had departed, then made its way up the coast to Da Nang, but failing to trade there, continue to Manila. The second was the Beverly, captained by John Gardner, which White had seen in Manila. White's arrival in Saigon was followed by 4 months of almost totally unproductive ceremony and haggling with the Cochin Chinese authorities. During his stay there, White developed an appreciation of the economic and political potential of Cochin China and its people, but this impression was wholly overridden by his thorough disgust with their personal habits, their culture, and above all, their complete and unashamed duplicity. It would be tedious to the reader and painful to myself to recapitulate the constant villainy and turpitude which we experienced from these people during our residence in the country, their total want of faith, constant eagerness to deceive and overreach us, and their pertinacity in trying to gain by shuffling and maneuvering what might have been better and easier gained by openness and fair dealing, the tedious forms and ceremonies in transacting all kinds of business, carried into the most trifling transactions, the uncertainty of the eventual ratification of any bargain, the least hope of wearing the patience of the purchaser out, and inducing him to offer a little more, being sufficient to annul any verbal stipulation, and there being no appeal unless there is a written contract which is never made, till every art has been used, and every engine of extortion put in motion and exhausted to gain more. All these vexations, combined with the rapacious, faithless, despotic, and anti-commercial character of the government, will, as long as these causes exist, render Cochin China the least desirable country for mercantile adventurers. These causes have made the Japanese relinquish the trade. They have driven the Portuguese of Macau from the country and turned their commerce into other channels, and are yearly and rapidly lessening their intercourse with China and Siam. The philanthropist, the man of enterprise, and the civilized world generally can see in the present miserable state of this naturally fine country no other than a source of deep regret and commiseration. In his account, White openly expresses his disappointment with his experience, and he refers in several places to other accounts of Cochin China which had led him to anticipate a quite different reception. He attributes the stark contrast between these accounts and his own experience to a marked deterioration in the conditions of life of the Cochin Chinese brought on by an increasingly despotic leadership in Hue. That leadership, according to White, had occupied itself more and more in wars of conquest and debauchery, laying waste a rich and fertile land and destroying the morale and well-being of its people. White notes that the French had had a very positive and constructive influence on the Cochin Chinese in years past, but the current situation had become precarious, forcing the French to prepare for abandoning their colonial adventure. He records that the French bishop Adrian, dead some years by then, had been a towering figure in Cochin China, and White suggests that his death led to a deterioration. White recounted the state of affairs to warn others who might have been tempted to seek trading opportunities in the miserable land of Cochin China. White's account includes a description of the royal citadel at Hue, paralleling that of Briggs, although it differs considerably in its specific detail. White claims to have obtained the description from an American gentleman who was at Tehran a short time after one left it. White proceeds from this description to generalize about the country. These people have great quickness of perception and a disposition to acquire a knowledge of the arts and sciences, and with the exception of their coasting craft, which are decidedly primitive, they have, under the instruction of the French, made considerable advances in naval architecture according to European ideas, nor have they been inattentive to fortification, the art of war in general, and the manufactures connected with it. These facts prove beyond a doubt that there was no physical defect in them, and the annals of the country, with the testimony of travelers, show in respect to moral characteristics that while they were under a mild and equitable government, they were a kind, hospitable, polite, vivacious, honest, and industrious people. Cochin China is perhaps, of all the powers in Asia, the best adapted to maritime adventure, from her local situation in respect to other powers, from her facilities towards the production of a powerful navy to protect her commerce, from the excellency of her harbors, and from the aquatic nature of her population on the seaboard, the enemies rivaling even the Chinese as sailors. Continuing in this vein, White applied value judgments to Cochin China's national priorities that reflected his naval background and seemed more appropriate to a young, dynamic United States than to a small but ancient people and culture. A prince who would understand and pursue the true interests of his country would, instead of building cities like Hue, commit his abundant resources to the ocean, under the protection of a powerful navy, which would also guarantee the safety of his maritime frontier. With the assistance of proper fortifications, a few small garrisons would effectually protect the interior, already naturally guarded by lofty and inaccessible mountains, and boundless and impenetrable forests, from the incursions of a hostile army. He would remove the vexatious restrictions by which commerce is now shackled, and invite his neighbors and strangers to a liberal participation in its blessings, which would at the same time be the means of enriching his own country, and introducing the arts of more civilized and polished nations. But it is to be feared that this is not likely soon to be realized, for the swarthy, ill-favored heir apparent to the crown of Annam is an avaricious, narrow-minded man, and the impending destiny of the country appears gloomy. On 30th January 1820, a sadder and wiser man, and having contracted what he described as elephantiasis, Lieutenant White led both ships out of Saigon with only partial cargoes of sugar and raw silk. The Franklin and the Marmion made up the rest of their cargo in Java and sailed for home. The Franklin left the Marmion in Mauritius and returned to Salem on 31st August 1820, some 20 months after its departure. One modern French observer judges White's experience in Cochin China harshly, describing White as a rigid Puritan who judged the local people from a limited viewpoint and who never wondered to what extent the attitude of the Vietnamese was conditioned by his own. Nevertheless, this observer acknowledges that White's account of South Vietnam, designed to be a useful work for the commerce of his country, painted a picture which, despite its errors and blemishes, was vivid and picturesque. The observer also speculates that White's published account resulted in the diversion of American ships from Indochina and thus hindered the arrival of foreigners whose presence could have created a serious obstacle to the French. This observer claims that no American commercial ship appeared in Saigon between 1820 and 1860. Although this French observer may be factually correct in his statement that no American commercial ships appeared in Saigon between 1820 and 1860, it seems a heavy burden of responsibility to lay on John White alone. Surely, the failure of the U.S. government to negotiate commercial agreements with Cochin China over that same period, together with the attitude of the Cochin Chinese authorities described by White himself, must have had at least an equally negative impact on any potential U.S. trade there.